Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody, it's Tuesday, August the 12th, 2025. We've done, as regular viewers and listeners of the show know, lots and lots of shows about the history of African Americans, particularly in the 19th century, before and after the so-called emancipation of slavery. And it's always occurred to me that it would have been better, or certainly wiser and more logical for American blacks, given what they experienced in the slave period, to simply go off west in America and found their own state, Moses style, as we know from the Old Testament. Although Moses never quite led the children of Israel to the promised land, he disappeared on the way. And there is, in fact, a black Moses, I've discovered. My guest today, Caleb Gayle, has a new book out about it. A black Moses who did indeed try to lead his people to a promised land within America. It's a saga of ambition and the fight for a black state. It's by a remarkable man called Edward P. McCabe. He sounds a figure from Hollywood, but he's real. And so is Caleb Gayle. Caleb, congratulations on the book. It's out today.
Andrew, that means a lot to me. Yes, I'm so glad to be with you.
So why, before we start, Caleb, and it's probably my ignorance as well, I'm sure McCabe is better known than I would imagine, but why is he not the kind of figure who comes to mind, you know, a Lincoln, a Jefferson? Why don't we know so much about this guy, McCabe?
I think we don't know as much about McCabe because history usually is written by and for those who we deem to be victors. And Edward McCabe is far from that, right? Even though, like Moses, he got close to, saw into what he thought could be a promised land, but as you mentioned, didn't ever make it into a promised land. So I think part of what McCabe did was, yes, try and stipulate that Black people could create their own state. But ultimately, because he wasn't successful, we oftentimes glaze over that story, glaze over that history. I think also because the American West is a story told of rugged individualism and hard-knuckled, lawless, godless approaches. And the story of a Black man leading a collective effort of thousands of Black people really cuts against that narrative in a way that's uncomfortable for a lot of people. So I think for those two reasons, both his status as functionally someone who tried really hard but failed, and as someone who cuts against the grain of kind of the Western mythos, he ends up getting forgotten like so many other people throughout American history.
Yeah, one person who hasn't been forgotten, of course, or one group who haven't been forgotten in terms of this narrative are the Mormons, the Church of the Latter-day Saints. We've done some shows on them, especially recently, given their more tolerant Christian politics. Are there some analogies with that narrative of the westward trail and the persecution of these people and their leadership and their, of course, eventual, I guess, success in Utah, although it's a checkered narrative?
Certainly a checkered narrative. And quite frankly, when you look at the history of the American West, there are significant parallels, right? The American West, Oklahoma in particular, but then just generally throughout the Old West, the American West was kind of posited to the American people as a chance to do a few things. One, to begin again, right? That you've perhaps in the Northeast or in the Southeast have come to the conclusion that this isn't for you. In the case of the people that McCabe led, Black people who had gone through the throes of enslavement, seen emancipation, seen the rising hopes of Reconstruction dashed by the white lash of redemption, they had seen that perhaps, you know what, the South really might not be there for us. In fact, one of those exodusters who was a very close friend of McCabe, a guy named Benjamin Pap Singleton, said, "We aim to teach the South and the whole of America a lesson, which is that you need us, and you're going to see what it's like when we try and do this on our own." So I think in many cases, the West has been this almost laboratory experiment, sadly, that the US government had used throughout time to test out, well, maybe we can refashion what America can be and what it can mean for a lot of people. And the ambitions that people like McCabe pursued were very much akin and analogous to the work of a lot of underrepresented or marginalized groups, be they poor whites, be they people who now we would consider of Hispanic descent, indigenous populations, Black populations. The only sad truth is that the zero-sum politics that undergirded their time then and still undergird our politics now really force people's dreams, aspirational they might have been, to really collide, and sometimes in very dangerous and violent ways.
Yeah, speaking, of course, of indigenous American peoples, the Vale of Tears and the catastrophic narrative of I wouldn't call it necessarily a genocide, although I'm sure some people might. Certainly their experience of being forced west and dying on the way. You talk about this narrative, McCabe's narrative, in terms of beginning again. It's all too American, isn't it? Did he recognize that there was something peculiarly American about a group of people picking up and saying, we're going to begin again. We don't like where we are. We're going to go out west?
His pitch directly to the president of the United States at the time, Benjamin Harrison, was just that, right? Like, give us the opportunity, and I'm paraphrasing here, give us the opportunity to show that we can govern ourselves here in America. Give us the opportunity to do what so many others have done, right? We've seen this often, right? Where people of color or people who have been throughout history marginalized, even in more recent history, kind of co-opt or adopt the language of, people who we consider our founders and use it for their own purposes to advance their inclusion, to kind of force their inclusion in the American enterprise of democracy and participation. So McCabe, like King would do later, like so many others had done before, like Frederick Douglass, had insisted on this being a very American project, not something other-earthly, not something un-American, but in fact something so duly American that it deserved the attention of, even at that time, the President of the United States.
Yeah, McCabe has, not only was it an American enterprise, there's no more American name than McCabe. In fact, when I read about your book and McCabe, I thought of the great 1971 movie, McCabe and Mrs. Miller, by Robert Altman. It's one of the great masterpieces of Altman, who's one of the finest American directors. And I don't want to turn this into another movie conversation, but one could almost imagine, it features Warren Beatty, but one could almost imagine him being Black in the movie.
Without question, right? It's not to say that these stories are just interchangeable or anything like that, but there are, even in fiction, like that wonderful, wonderful movie by Robert Altman. I mean, what Robert Altman always has done is been able to really pinpoint certain thematic thrusts that we see in our everyday life, and almost some of the almost documentary style shooting that he might do that almost feels as if you're watching real life happen. And likewise, very real actions throughout time, these non-fictional tales, right? And so to some extent, I always felt as if it was my duty to do what even an Altman does in a fictional sense, right, on the screen, but here in a nonfiction sense, which is to give people a glimpse into the tale that seems both as new as it does old, right? As American as it almost feels strange, which is people that you're not used to seeing, like Edward McCabe, saying, no, I have a vision and a dream for what America can mean for me and people like me. And so in that way, I just felt as if McCabe almost has these collisions with fictional tales as well, like Altman's wonderful flick.
And I'm guessing, Caleb, that there was a huge debate broadly, obviously within the African American community, but also within the people that McCabe was leading, about whether America as a project could be saved. The issue of forgiveness, of course, is one of the features of the Old Testament and Moses and God. You mentioned Frederick Douglass, who in his own way, a freed slave, forgave America, gave it another chance to begin again. Was McCabe convinced that America deserved that second chance, given the unspeakable cruelty and injustice of slavery?
I always found McCabe interesting because he was never enslaved, right? He grew up ostensibly in Troy, New York, which had kind of developed a reputation for its abolitionist streak. He spent time throughout New England and Bangor, Maine, and Newport, Rhode Island. He went to boarding school. He worked on Wall Street. He advised Potter Palmer, right? He kind of lived a bit of a primrose life that even for a lot of Black people today, I imagine would be somewhat enviable. Yet and still, it was really important for me to kind of highlight for the reader that he insisted, even into his very later years, which did not end the way he wanted them to, he insisted on there being a very clear place for Black people in that project, not in opposition to, not outside of, but at a seat at the table, a table that they created, a table that would be in service of identifying the ways in which they could take part in a democratic experiment that would benefit them, right? And I think that sort of brass knuckled politics mixed with aspiration is what makes this story so interesting, whilst at the same time will I think ring in some cases familiar, will resonate with audiences who might not ever think to themselves that this even happened, let alone had ever even thought about turning their attention to the American West. I kind of make the argument that the American West, and specifically Oklahoma, tell us a lot more about America than we oftentimes think, in many cases for both the good and for the challenging.
Yeah, and you know a lot about Oklahoma. You grew up there. When I look at a picture of McCabe on Wikipedia, and this is, I guess, a reflection of the unavoidable race-centric way we think about things. When I read about the story and this man, Edward McCabe, who tried to create a free Black state or mini-state within America, and when I look at him, it occurs to me that he doesn't look very Black. I mean, is that my own, shall we say, racism? Or is that how he portrayed himself? Tell me a little bit about his background, how he became this middle-class Black American who had the power and the experience to try to lead his people to a promised land.
Yeah, so both of his parents were Black people. We don't know near as much about the ancestry beyond them. But I think that one thing that I think is really important to remember is that, Blackness is a much more diverse and expansive idea, right? And maybe he could have, right? Like a lot of people throughout time, maybe he had the opportunity to perhaps even pass as white, even though he was not. In fact,
it's very vivid. I mean, if I haven't got a photo of Douglass, but comparing and contrasting visually McCabe and Douglass would be an interesting juxtaposition.
I imagine it would be. And in fact, it was said in some newspapers in Kansas when he was first running for office to become the state auditor of Kansas, one of the very first statewide elected Black politicians in the American West, people would say, oh, we wonder if he's taken on the name McCabe so as to fool the audience to think that he was Irish, right? And then they say, well, God forbid that, because of our own kind of anti-Irish sentiments that were, existent in America at that time. So to some extent, I think what we see is that McCabe really took on and enmeshed himself in a community that he knew he was from, despite the fact that perhaps maybe he could have passed. And I think even more than that, when you look at the crowd of friends that he had, his comrades in these struggles, both in Nicodemus, Kansas, where he went first, and then eventually to Oklahoma Territory, these were people who were unmistakably Black, right? From the phenotype perspective, like there was no question when you see them in the record that they were Black. These are the people that he aligned himself with. These are the folks that he decided to double down on. And I think in that way, he ended up demonstrating that racial progress, when fought for, doesn't require some sort of litmus test, doesn't require some sort of brown paper bag test, that in fact, it required identifying who you were and why who you were and are is meaningful to the diverse multiracial democracy that we want to create, where we're not limited by our pigment or our skin tone, but rather we understand that that project requires that all of us, diverse as we may be, deserve to kind of create the sort of country that we want and want to be a part of.
The book's getting great reviews. It got a starred review, Black Moses, on Publishers Weekly, which is always the bellwether for books. It's written beautifully, Caleb. I don't want to give away the whole story, as you note, in comparing, in thinking about the work of Robert Altman in his McCabe and Mrs. Miller, that there is always, if you like, a fictional quality to the best true story. So I don't want to give away the whole story, but just give us some background. Where was he from? What did he do? And what did and didn't he accomplish?
Sure. So I appreciate you for wanting to avoid giving away too much. But as we kind of know, right, Oklahoma is not a Black state. There is no Black state in our fair union. So that's probably giving away a ton. But one thing that I can say is that the journey to get there is really quite fascinating and gripping. And to provide some tidbits for your viewers and listeners that hopefully will inspire them to engage with the work in some, it's that he was not expected to do what he did, right? Imagine if you were like McCabe, right? You're born in relative privilege, especially compared to your Black brothers and sisters in different parts of the country, especially in the American South. And you go to boarding schools, you work on Wall Street, but what the example of Wall Street presented to him is that though he was a clerk, right? And if your listeners or viewers watch The Gilded Age, you'll recognize some of these sorts of—
Yeah, my wife watches that.
Exactly, right? My wife and I are also addicted. But what you'll see is that there was a great desire to try and jump ahead of the station you might have been born into. And one of the ways in which people did that, Black, white, or otherwise, was to become a clerk. And he did the same, right? Moved to New York, worked for an investment firm there, and realized that because of his race, right? Even though, as you mentioned earlier, he's a much lighter skinned guy, because of his race, he was really remanded to the task of a porter, right? Cleaning up, taking out trash, things that it's honorable work, but not the work he intended to do. And so that's why he goes west to Chicago and starts working for Potter Palmer. And if your listeners and viewers don't know who that is, he really was considered like the hotel king of State Street, one of the major thoroughfares in Chicago. And his work also spawned things like Marshall Field, which is was a huge department store that I know Chicagoans and Michiganders are going to know a lot about.
And under Palmer, I know you know that he learned how to sell a dream, an all too American thing, really.
Exactly. The customer is always right? That's one of the things that's usually attributed to Potter Palmer and Marshall Field, that notion that if you can sell it, if you can build it, they're in fact going to come. And so when he departs for Kansas, he does so with his best friend, a darker skinned, very kind of well astute Black man named A.T. Hall Jr. His father was the founder of one of the largest Black congregations in Chicago. And they set about initially to go to a completely different part of Kansas, but that's when they meet someone named John Niles, who by all accounts was a huckster, a bit of a crook, who was running this town called Nicodemus veritably into the ground, at which point McCabe and A.T. Hall step into a position of leadership. And it's in that way that they start to test out, start to see what it means to kind of create a quotidian existence while realizing the massive consequences of that quotidian existence for Black people on the American West.
So just to remind ourselves, Caleb, what year was this?
Yeah, so this is Initially, when he goes to Kansas, it's the 1870s, right before the kind of mass migration of formerly enslaved people out of the American South into the American West, primarily Kansas, known as exodusters.
And in terms of his narrative, if he had one, of Black America, we were at a moment where the promise of post-Civil War America had been replaced by a cynicism of reaction. Is that fair?
That's more than fair. In reality, it was a dark time, right? If you were living in the American South as a Black person, you were starting to see that, 1876 came and went, and the federal troops were withdrawn from monitoring the actions of a lot of these individuals. If you were living in South Carolina, you saw the massacres that took place in Hamburg, South Carolina, formerly almost all Black town, and you saw the retrenchment of some of these ideals. You saw your political leaders, Black political leaders who had achieved a great deal within the kind of 12-ish years since the Civil War, start to lose elections. You saw, in fact, significant threats of violence that weren't even threats, they were promises that were being delivered upon. And so that's why they started to leave like mad. I mean, it wasn't well organized. People were waiting on packet ships, like ships that were meant to deliver mail. They were jumping off of barges, former politicians who had developed leadership, and just taking off for Kansas. So to some extent, it was a time of significant upheaval and despair. And so to some extent, what McCabe was offering was a bit of a beacon. He was among several. And once he realized that established a significant power base, he jumped to becoming one of the very first statewide elected Black politicians in the Old West. And when he lost his third term, on account of racism, that's when he began to really hatch a scheme that he called, it's the complicated one, he called it a colonization scheme. Right? He meant to colonize. As awful as that term sounds and is, he meant to colonize the Oklahoma Territory for Black people, especially as the U.S. government was opening the lands of Oklahoma for public purchase and colonization.
Well, it shows that both Blacks and whites can be seduced by the C word, colonization, that they're both capable of doing it and both capable of envisioning, although I assume that in terms of colonization, what was his attitude to, and this perhaps speaks not so much of Moses, but of Zionism and Herzl, what was his attitude towards the people who were already on the land? If they weren't Black, would they go somewhere else?
Sure. So to some extent, you really kind of keyed in on a central tension in the book. There were already people there, right? Yes,
the old Israel story, the Zionism story.
Correct. I mean, there were an enormous amount of people who had established generations of customs, rules, laws, governance. I mean, my first book really kind of highlighted that there were significant populations who were in charge of that area.
And just to give a plug for that, your first book is We Refuse to Forget, a True Story of Black Creeks, American Identity and Power. So it's so you're very well grounded in this narrative on lots of fronts.
For sure. And the United States government really, with something called the Dawes Commission, which we don't have time to go into, really decided to dictate who was going to be indigenous, who was going to be a member of what tribes and not. And what that did ultimately was that it reduced the acreage that they owned by tens of millions of acres. And that provided the opportunity for the United States government to then say, okay, now we are inviting you to take a run on the land. And if you can get there and you can claim it, you can keep it for 5 years, it's yours. And so to some extent, McCabe enlisted himself in the very same process. Now, some of his followers were at the other side of gunpoints on several occasions. I include some of them in the book, where they had infringed upon a lot of the land that was promised and deeded to a lot of indigenous populations. And that made it very, very complicated, very, very dangerous, and also incredibly American, right? We do this in America, that we oftentimes build beautiful things atop broken promises, severed dreams, and histories that we would prefer to forget.
Yeah, the narrative, of course, is a land without people for a people without land, which is never true. It was never true in North America. It's not true in Palestine, and it certainly wasn't true in Oklahoma. What about the political background? As you know, this was a dark moment for Black Americans, many dark moments in their history, but a particularly disappointing one given the promise of post-Civil War America. And of course, without wishing to turn this into another complicated history lesson, a lot of the responsibility for that disappointment, I mean, you can always blame the South for everything, but it also lay in the North and the deal that white Northern politicians made with the South. Did Caleb Gayle and his people, did they understand that? Was there any trust in Washington, in DC, in the American state, or was there thinking, well, we really can't trust these people. Look what they've done in the South. We're going to go and do our own thing.
Sure. I think that I think you meant, instead of Caleb Gayle and his people, I think you meant Edward McCabe and his people.
Sorry, whoops. That was a Freudian error, Caleb. I meant, yeah. You don't have any people, do you? I know you're in Watertown.
I don't have
lead them up the Charles River.
No, I make those sort of Freudian slips all the time. Essentially, to answer your question most directly without going into a discursive history lesson, the best way I can say it is that there was and still is an enduring hope within America that it'll make good on its promises, right? That the aspirations included in our founding documents are in fact inclusive, or could be bent to be inclusive, could be shaped to include more people. And so to some extent, that's why McCabe organized the colonization scheme, is because he said, well, if these are the rules that you're giving me, then these are the rules I'm going to live by. And so the whole hope was, if I can get, even after he met with President Harrison, it didn't seem as if President Harrison was interested in backing McCabe's bid to make Oklahoma an all-Black state, he decided, look, if I can still get enough Black people to move, I can get enough voters to make Oklahoma a Black state with a Black governor, Black senators, Black congressmen. In fact, as readers will, as your viewers and listeners will note when they become readers of this book, a lot of the first set of chapters deals with this idea that McCabe is being maligned for, called Negro supremacy. That the idea was that he wanted, yes, to establish his own place by his own rules, with him, yes, at the top. I don't have that sort of braggadocious kind of feat of narcissism running through my veins, but it is quite fascinating, right? Which historical figure that we decide to spend our time with, that are exciting enough to write a book about, are people who are humble. That's not what you're going to find in McCabe. If you're looking for a humble, servile leader, you're not gonna find him in McCabe. But if you want someone who is conflictual and braggadocious and entertaining, you will find it here in Black Moses.
Yeah, it's interesting. We did a show a year or two ago, and about a new book which focused on African-American scholarly understanding of the Constitution and the way in which they relied on the Constitution to make their argument. I guess the Black Moses, Edward McCabe, did the same thing. Did he familiarize himself so intimately with the American narrative that he could turn its argument for his own benefit?
Without question. I mean, even his desire to go to the White House and request this of President Harrison is him reflecting on what has happened in the past. There had been something called the American Colonization Society, which thought to themselves, let's dispatch Black people to Liberia. As readers will come to learn about, they're going to learn about the Cow Island experiment, where Black people who had recently found freedom at Freedom Fort in Virginia were then, in many cases, told, well, how about this island in Haiti, in which Haiti will become your home, and Haiti will be responsible for providing you citizenship, and Haiti will be responsible for securing that citizenship. But all of those actions, in some form or another, were underwritten by the US government in some form or fashion, right? Or even senators and congressmen like Henry Lee, who tried to make portions of southern Texas a black area, black state, or a black colony, or as a Negro colony, as they would call it. So there had been numerous attempts. The only thing is that in the past, they were all endeavored or pursued or posited by white people. So McCabe's innovation was to say, well, I'm going to take this very thing and I'm going to say, well, how about you let me do it? Now, in all those instances, there was support, widespread support, or significant financial support for like the Cow Island experiment off of Haiti, or even the American Colonization Society. But interestingly, when a Black person says, well, let me do it, in the case of McCabe, there isn't assent. In fact, there's opposition.
Surprise, surprise. So how serious was this? I mean, again, we don't want to give away the whole story, Caleb, but did he get close, or was it just a pipe dream?
Tens of thousands of Black people made their way to Oklahoma, made Oklahoma home. And not just that, almost every single one of those indigenous nations, right? The Creek Nation, Cherokee Nation, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole, they all had pretty sizable percentages of Black people who had been citizens already, who had been, in some cases, formerly enslaved, in other cases, never enslaved, who were citizens of these places. And so as such, there was a groundswell of support for it. And in many cases, and I don't want to give too much away, in many cases, it seemed very much like, with the quick uptick in the amount of all Black towns. At one point, Oklahoma had some 50 of them, right? I mean, if you can kind of imagine that. 50 all Black towns. And that's not counting where I am right now, which is Tulsa's Greenwood, the home of Black Wall Street. That doesn't count as a town because it's in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So there were 50 of these all Black towns in Oklahoma. It felt as if it could be something real.
But it wasn't. Why did it fail?
Without giving away too much, as you kind of alluded to, we don't want to always blame the South, but a famous historian, culture historian, said the whole of America is, in fact, the South. And to some extent, it's in part because Oklahoma decided to become the South. We talked earlier about whether, or like, why the West and what was the attraction of the West. Well, it was because it was an opportunity, invitation to try and reform and reshape what the future could be in America, at least in this part. And so when Oklahoma was given the chance to decide, it chose to become the South. And what do I mean by that? I mean that, you know, you look at Kansas and the first laws that they passed. You even look at places like Texas and the first laws that they passed as a newly admitted member of the Union. Arkansas, Colorado. None of those states chose to make their very first law passed a Jim Crow segregation law. But when you look at Oklahoma, the very first bill passed, Senate Bill 1, was a incredibly draconian, quite harsh ratification of Jim Crow in the West, right? And in many cases, it's what that, in fact, became the stakes, the path whereby McCabe would choose to essentially fight to his almost his dying day. It became a massive case that went all the way up to the Supreme Court, that McCabe spent a lot of his own dollars on, that he had accumulated after a lifetime of land dealing. That became the plane on which McCabe kind of fought his last battle. And so to some extent, the reason why is because Oklahoma fundamentally became the South. Even though it might not be identified as part of the South, that's the veneer it took on. That's the reality that it took on.
You wrote a kid's book about the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921. We've done some shows on that. Is Is that the in an odd way? You said you're talking from Greenwood, outside Tulsa, where there was a very wealthy, successful Black community, the so-called Black Wall Street. Do you, at least in your own mind, maybe not in the book, do you include the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre in the narrative of McCabe? Was it in a kind of weird, tragic way the logical conclusion of his hopes?
It is the logical conclusion of his hopes, right? That when Black people, not just in Tulsa, but in places like Bolling and Langston and Cassville and Taft and a host of other places, when they start to create for themselves an opportunity to adopt their own set of rules that are in many cases analogous to the rules of the road here in America writ large, and they start to build a significant level of prosperity as a result, it's not deemed as a success that's allowed to flourish as such, but rather a threat. And that's, again, back to the same zero-sum politics. Heather McGhee wrote a phenomenal book about
Yeah, Heather was on the show when her first book came out.
Yeah, she's great. She blurred my book, and I think she saw the parallels there, right?
Yeah, I mean, she's written extensively on Texas, hasn't she?
She has, and I think it's exactly those sorts of ideas that, oh, if that Black community is doing well, somehow through the lens of zero-sum politics, somehow then I, a non-Black person, am not doing well. And in actuality, I think it compels us to reframe our thinking such that perhaps a lot more of us can be doing well without thinking that that means that we're sacrificing everyone else having an opportunity, a shot even, to do well. And so that's, to some extent, the painful conclusion to the story of McCabe. It happened a year after he died, actually.
So did the Tulsa Race Massacre and McCabe's failure to create an independent Black state within America in Oklahoma, does that strengthen the arguments of people like Marcus Garvey, who came around at the beginning of the 20th century, the Back to Africa movement, who simply said that we've given America enough chances. We don't want to give it another chance. We're going to go back. We're going to go back to Liberia. We're going to go back to where we were from. Does his failure, in your mind at least, and perhaps in others, does it strengthen the Back to Africa philosophy?
You know, what's funny is that what your listeners and viewers, when they become readers, will find out is that McCabe was reached out to, right, by people like Chief Albert Sam, who were part of these efforts to try and Chief Sam in particular tried very explicitly to get a bunch of Black Oklahomans to join him on this journey, right? What I think it does is that it reifies the notion that belonging here in the United States is going to be a much more complicated journey, right? It's going to be a much more difficult journey, right? And it removes whatever sort of idea we once had that it could be easy, it could be quick, and it could be equitable. And I don't think Black people have ever had that sort of notion in America, but I do think a lot of people who are not Black have the notion that, well, why can't you just belong? Well, in part because when we've tried in all the different ways possible and available to us, and even not available to us, we've been shown that the journey just is going to be harder. So I can't ever knock or can't ever even besmirch or bemoan the efforts made thereafter by, yes, people like Marcus Garvey, but also Chief Sam and others who really did identify that, my goodness, like, what else must we do here in America to make it clear that we belong and that our belonging won't be compromised?
Let's end, Caleb, by fast forwarding to today, to August 2025. There's obviously many, many references to the present and perhaps even the future in the book. I don't want to turn this into another Trump-obsessed conversation, but The Smithsonian, for example, has been involved as a museum in supposedly restoring Trump, or trying. There's a huge battle about what the Smithsonian should and shouldn't show about Trump. I'm guessing that there'll be similar debates about somebody like McCabe. What does this story tell us about the America of 2025, the America of MAGA, of Donald Trump, and the debates, and perhaps in some ways the lack of debates happening in this country today?
I think the story in the book speaks to today in three ways. One, it tells us that it's worth trying, that trying in and of itself can be its own means of salvation, right? And a lot of us, right, not just for a lot of us, you know, I think of the old seaman's prayer, right? Like, my boat is so small, but the ocean is so vast, right? I'm paraphrasing it, but the idea that, oh my goodness, like, how can I make any sort of meaningful change given the enormity of the issues? And if you flashed up that article there just now, that is a moment where it can feel like, oh goodness, like, how can I make any sort of meaningful impact? Well, I think what was interesting was that McCabe,
in fact, and there's another article in Ebony about some people fighting back against the dismantling of African American history. The National Museum of African American History and Culture, the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., which is a remarkable building and a remarkable project, has, of course, become one of the great cultural political controversies of the Trump age.
Yeah, I think what it forces us into the second point is that we should channel some of that trying into, yes, fighting these actions, but then likewise also ensuring that our histories are told even that much more, right? In all sorts of forms that we possibly can, right? It means that we should run to these efforts to try and capture this history from the grips of forgetfulness into ensuring that, you know, people of all sorts get the ability to access it. I think the last thing, and of course, because I'm a journalist, I'm a writer, I can't help but say that, like, it's important that these stories are told beautifully, that they're not just historians and academics such as myself kind of talking one to another, but that rather we think very carefully about the sort of critical intervention we can be making in the lives of a lot of people by ensuring that we think about the popular audience, right? About the broader group of people who likewise can benefit from these stories. So to some extent, I just feel that much more, not even encouraged, but motivated to try, motivated to continue capturing these stories, motivated, not even trying to make them presently relevant, but to make sure that they're of such quality that you can't help but seeing the parallels, seeing how it resonates, feeling how it resonates today.
Yeah, and the more you talk, I think of the new movie Sinners, which I'm sure you've seen.
Yes.
Which is McCabe on a minuscule scale of a group of Black people who wanted to create their own dance club, and the way in which people responded. So good stuff from Caleb Gayle, important new book, Black Moses, is out there. It's already getting rave reviews, a remarkable story, which certainly hasn't died, still as relevant today in some ways as it's ever been. Caleb, congratulations on the book. Great to have you on the show. We'll have to get you back. Lots more to talk about. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew. You have a great one, sir.